The story you keep telling. Yourself is holding you back. You have been doing this your whole life without knowing it. Every morning you wake up and before you have said a single word to another person, before you have checked your phone or poured your coffee or looked in the mirror, a story is already running. It is not a story you chose consciously. It is one that was written incrementally across years of experience, disappointment, praise, failure, and the slow accumulation of conclusions you drew about what kind of man you are and what kind of life is available to you. It runs so automatically, so far, beneath the level of deliberate thought, that you do not experience it as a story at all. You experience it as reality. You experience it as just the way things are. This is the most expensive mistake a man can make, not because the story is always wrong, though often it is, but because a story believed without examination becomes a filter, and a filter changes everything that passes through it. The opportunity you do not pursue because the story says men like, you do not get those. The relationship you self-sabotage because the story says you are not the kind of man who gets to keep something that good. The version of yourself you never quite step into because the story has already decided who you are, and stepping beyond that boundary feels less like growth and more like a lie you're telling the world. So you stay inside the story. You furnish it, you defend it, and the years pass, inside a frame you built from old pain and call it truth. What makes this particularly difficult is that your story is not pure fiction. It is made from real events. Someone did leave, something did fail. You were told, explicitly or implicitly, that you were too much or not enough in ways that left marks. The story grew from genuine soil, and that is exactly what gives it its authority. You cannot simply dismiss it as irrational because it is not entirely irrational. It is a reasonable conclusion drawn from a limited set of data, then applied universally, permanently, and without appeal. That is the problem. Not that the story is false, but that it is frozen. It stopped updating the moment it felt confirmed, and everything since then has been interpreted through its lens rather than allowed to challenge it. This chapter is about the precise mechanism by which your internal narrative shapes your external reality, and what it takes to rewrite the parts of it that are keeping you smaller than you actually are. Not through positive thinking, not through affirmations pasted to your bathroom mirror, but through the kind of honest, structural examination that requires you to look at what you have been telling yourself and ask, with real seriousness, whether it is still true, whether it was ever fully true, and whether you're willing to live inside it for another decade. The internal narrative, the story a man carries about who he is and what he deserves, functions exactly like your operating system, running beneath every application you use, you interact with. The applications, you troubleshoot them, you update them occasionally, but the operating system underneath, the layer that determines what is even possible within your experience, runs silently in the background, and most men never think to examine it. They spend their lives adjusting the surface while the foundation remains unquestioned. They change jobs, change relationships, change cities, and bring the same story with them into every new context, and then wonder why the results keep rhyming. Consider a man who grew up in a household where his emotional needs were consistently minimized, not through cruelty necessarily, but through the particular kind of emotional unavailability that gets passed down through generations of men who are taught that need is weakness. He learned, early and efficiently, that expressing what he actually felt created distance rather than connection, so he stopped. He built competence instead. He became the reliable one, the problem solver, the man who handles things, and he wrote a story around this adaptation. I'm not someone who needs much. I am better alone. Closeness is a trap. These conclusions felt like self-knowledge. They felt like wisdom earned from experience. They were actually a child's survival strategy, calcified into a man's identity, still running 30 years later in every relationship he touched. You probably recognize some version of this. The specific content of your story is your own, but the architecture is nearly universal. Something happened. A conclusion was drawn. The conclusion became a conviction, and the conviction began filtering every subsequent experience to confirm itself. Psychologists call this confirmation bias, but that clinical term does not quite capture the lived experience of it, which is less like a thinking error and more like a gravity. The story pulls everything toward it. Good evidence gets minimized, contradicting evidence gets explained away, and the man lives, year after year, inside a narrative whose primary function is no longer to help him navigate reality but to protect him from having to revise a painful belief about himself. Here is the misconception that keeps most men from addressing this. They believe that if they just achieve enough, the story will change on its own. Get the promotion, get the physique, get the relationship, and the internal voice that says you are not. Enough will finally quiet down because you will have proven it. Wrong. This is one of the most common and most exhausting strategies a man can run. It does not work. Not at the level that matters, because achievement feeds the ego, but it does not reach the story. The story lives deeper than accomplishment. You can be objectively successful by every external measure and still wake up every morning running the same narrative about your fundamental inadequacy, your unlovability, your essential aloneness. The trophies sit on the shelf and the story keeps playing underneath them, unmoved. The reframe is structural. You do not silence the story through achievement or through willpower or through convincing yourself it is wrong. You change it by doing something far more uncomfortable. You trace it back to its origin, and you examine the original evidence with the eyes of the man you are. Now, rather than the eyes of the boy who first drew the conclusion, when you do this honestly, you will often find something surprising. The evidence that felt so conclusive at the time was actually quite thin. A father who could not express love was not proof that you are unworthy of it. A relationship that ended badly was not proof that intimacy always destroys. You, a failure that defined you at 23, was not a permanent verdict on your capacity. The conclusion was real, the pain was real, but the universal law you derived from it was a story, not a fact, and stories, unlike facts, can be rewritten. This does not mean the rewriting is easy or fast. It means it is possible, which is the only thing you need to know to begin. The concrete practice starts with a single question asked slowly and without mercy. What is the story I keep telling myself about why this particular thing in my life cannot change? Not the surface explanation, not the reasonable sounding narrative about timing or circumstance, but the deeper one, the one that sounds like, men like me do not get to have that. Or, every time I get close to something good, I ruin it. Or, I have always been this way and it is too late to be anything different. Find that sentence. It will likely arrive with a feeling of certainty that is slightly uncomfortable to examine, because certainty about our limitations is one of the ego's most reliable defense mechanisms. The certainty is not evidence of truth. It is evidence of how long the story has been running unchallenged. You need to sit with that sentence and ask three things. First, where did this conclusion originally come from? And how old was I when I drew it? Second, have I been interpreting every related experience since then through this lens, regardless of what the experience actually showed? Third, what would I have to believe about myself for this story to no longer be necessary? That third question is the hardest one, because the story, as painful as it is, also provides something. It provides predictability. It provides a reason not to try. It provides a coherent explanation for why the life you want is not available to you. And that explanation, however limiting, is more comfortable than the terrifying openness of a life in which you might actually be capable of more than you have allowed yourself to attempt. The man who does this work does not emerge from it with a shinier, more optimistic story. He emerges with something more valuable, a more honest one, a story with more room in, e.t., a narrative that is held loosely enough to be updated when new evidence arrives, rather than gripped so tightly that it reshapes every new experience to confirm what was decided years ago in a moment of pain. There is a particular kind of freedom that becomes available when a man finally stops defending his limitations as though they were his identity. It does not arrive loudly. It does not feel like a revelation in the moment. It feels more like a loosening, a quiet sense that the walls of what is possible have moved outward slightly, and that the energy you were spending on keeping the story intact is now available for something else. That energy, redirected, is not small. Most men are spending enormous resources maintaining a narrative that is working against them, and they have been doing it for so long that they Mistake the exhaustion for just the weight of being alive. The stories that hurt us most are never the obviously false ones. They are the ones with just enough truth in them to seem unquestionable. They are the ones that developed during the periods when we were most vulnerable and most in need of a framework that made sense of our pain. We built them to survive, and they serve that purpose. The problem is not that we built them. The problem is that we never gave ourselves permission to retire them once we were strong enough to live. Without them, this is not work you do once and finish. It is a practice of ongoing honesty, a commitment to noticing when your interpretation of events is being shaped by an old conclusion, rather than the actual evidence in front of you. It is the willingness to catch yourself mid-story and ask whether you are reporting reality or narrating a version of it that confirms something you decided about yourself before you fully knew who you were. That question, asked consistently over time, is one of the most quietly radical things a man can do. The people who benefit most from you doing this work are not only you, they are everyone who has to meet the man shaped by an unchallenged story, who has to navigate the defensive edges, the preemptive withdrawals, the ways you protect yourself from things that stopped being dangerous years ago. When the story loosens, something in you becomes more available, more present, more capable of genuine contact with the people and the life in front of you, rather than the ones the story is already scripted. The story you have been telling yourself is not who you are. It is what you concluded about yourself when you were not yet equipped to see the full picture, and you are equipped now.